I'm David Cothran, and this is Meet the Ocean Encounters. In the very early days of the Undersea Specialist program with Lindblad Expeditions, this was long before we had our alliance with National Geographic, there were pretty much no rules. We just kind of invented the game as we went along. We did it first in Baja, and then Tove Peterson and I were the first polar divers in the program, and we did that up in Svalbard. That's where I learned to do really freezing cold diving, polar diving. And then within the next year or two, we moved the program down to the Antarctic. And once things really got rolling, Dennis Cornejo and I were the only two people really doing the job. We hadn't moved it much to the other ships yet. And Dennis and I more or less just split the year between us. We'd just talk among ourselves, and I'll do these 2 months, you do those 2 months, and we just got down to the Antarctic or wherever we were and said, okay, let's try a dive here. But when I say we, I mean Dennis and I separately, because another thing we didn't have back then were dive buddies. Dennis is an instructor, so he taught a lot of the crew to dive. He was really generous about giving them lessons, and he sort of developed himself some dive buddies. A couple of people, especially a couple of our bakers, turned out to be very skilled divers, and Dennis liked to dive with them. But I like to dive alone. It's something that you're taught not to do when you do your open water certification, and there are good reasons for that. But I felt there were also good reasons for my preferring to dive alone in extreme situations. And once in a while I'd take somebody with me, but I was always more comfortable and I felt safer underwater just by myself. So when I was diving, I would drill self-rescue procedures. I carried a pony tank, a small extra bottle of gas on the side of my own tank, and I would drill various situations. And, when I was out down there without much to film, sometimes you're just swimming around and there's just not much going on. So when I encountered a situation like that, I'd stop for a few minutes and do an entanglement drill. I'd pull out my dive knife and pretend I was cutting myself loose from some monofilament or something like that. And then I'd put that knife away and pretend I had dropped that knife, which is a very serious situation, and pull out my backup knife, which is down on my leg, and make sure I knew how to reach down there and get it without looking at it. And I'd, just drill like that. And another thing I drilled was switching first stages. In Antarctic diving gear, we use what's called an H valve, which allows us to mount two first stage regulators, the part that goes on your tank, at the top of the tank. When you start your dive, you have both first stages open, and if you have a problem with one of those first stages, you can close it and switch to the other one. And that problem is always free flow. The water is cold enough there that it can freeze your exhalation, and that freezes in the mouthpiece, the second stage of the regulator, and freezes it open. They never freeze shut. They always freeze open. They're designed that way. But when they freeze open, that means the air in your tank is just pouring out. Sometimes it just dribbles with a second stage free flow, and sometimes comes out pretty fast. But first stage free flows are more serious. In that case, it's not your exhalation, of course, but if you have a little moisture from rinsing your gear or something like that, a little moisture left in your first stage, if that freezes, it can be a really serious situation because it freezes wide open and the air just gushes out as though you'd cracked the valve in the tank completely. So I would drill this procedure of reaching back behind my neck and awkwardly turn one of the H valves off to switch to the other one. And I could do it pretty well, but what I also became aware of was that it was not easy, that it was awkward physically, and I usually wound up kind of lying sideways on the bottom, and that it took a little while. Okay, all that's background. The dive that I'm thinking of was at Devil Island, which is in the Weddell Sea. Devil's a little island that's kind of tucked into a notch on the north coast of a much bigger island called Vega. It's a very dramatic place, and there's often a lot of big ice there. Big bergs often accumulate there. And that it was that way this day. It was a beautiful day. A little bit of wind, but lots of big ice right off the beach. So I dropped in and got down to the bottom, and the bottom right there in front of the landing at Vega is pretty low angle. And that means in the Antarctic that most everything there gets wiped away by the passage of big icebergs, a phenomenon called ice scour. So there's not much there to see. But I knew from previous experience that if I swam down fairly deep, that there was a place where the angle changed, and there were little vertical bits of rock, little bluffs, you might say, kind of sticking out there, that were sheltered places where there was a lot more interesting life. Corals and anemones and things like that, some beautiful stuff. And that's what I wanted to film. So I was just swimming down the slope, and I saw the water ahead of me just got darker and darker. And I realized pretty quickly that what was going on was I was swimming under or toward the bottom of an iceberg, a big one. And the very last place I wanted to be was between this rocky bottom and about 10,000 tons, literally 10,000 tons of ice. So that wasn't much of a problem. I just made a right turn and swam until the water got a little lighter, and then made a left turn and continued down the slope. It was kind of exciting, but I've had a lot of experience, had already then a lot of experience with big ice. So I got around that and went on down the slope, and I found a beautiful little spot, nice little rocky promontory with a vertical face and some beautiful white, delicate, feathery, soft corals called Thorella. And this is at 90 feet, which is pretty deep for polar diving. But I felt comfortable there. Everything was going really well that day. So I'm setting up the first shot, and bang, first stage free flow. From everything's okay to all of a sudden, all the air in my tank is going out really, really fast. And I had only seconds to decide what to do. I might have been able to reach back and turn off the H valve, but I decided, and I think I've always thought, made a good decision, that was going to be too slow. And I think I knew that because of having tried it a lot. So instead, I left the bottom immediately and started for the surface. From 90 feet, you have to surface slowly. The maximum rate is about 1 foot per second to be safe. And then you, of course, hope to have a safety stop, a little non-technical decompression stop at about 15 feet. And that was a really long 90 seconds. I was watching my computer, watching the depth and watching the time and watching the gas go. The gas was coming out, the air was coming out of my second stage regulator, so it's pouring out under my ears on both sides of my head and just gushing all over the place. So it was, kind of a very unusual, kind of uncomfortable situation. But I'm slowly making my way up, and the buoyancy was no problem. I had a good control of the ascent at the right rate, but I just didn't know how the air in the tank was doing. All I could really tell while trying to watch the ascent rate was that it was going down fast. So I stopped at 15 feet for as long as I could, and usually we do a 3-minute safety stop. In the Antarctic, I always like to do a 5-minute safety stop for extra safety. And this time, I felt the tank really emptying after about 1 minute. So that was okay, but then I made it to the surface with no air at all in my tank, and that meant that I had to mouth inflate my BCD, the buoyancy compensation jacket I wear, like a life jacket that helps a diver adjust their buoyancy in the water. And it was really, by that time the wind had increased, it was really choppy. I was getting slapped in the face by waves while I was not floating very well at all at the surface. And there I was kind of, floating around the water, feeling pretty good about the fact that I was no longer at 90 feet or halfway up with no air. And a few minutes later, a Zodiac shuttle carrying guests back and forth from the shore went by, and I waved at them, and they came over and chatted with me for a minute and went back and told my safety boat, which was on the other side of the iceberg, where I was. And they came and got me. And the one thing, I just remembered this. I've told this story a few times, but I just remembered something I hadn't thought about for a while, which was that morning I had a feeling about being really careful. I'm really not much of a believer at all in anything psychic, but I remembered distinctly thinking, I'm a little nervous about diving today. And at that point, I was not really ever nervous about diving. But for some reason that morning, I just kind of had a slightly odd feeling, and I took kind of a careful attitude with me into the water. And it worked out. So I went on feeling that solo diving, I continued solo diving for years and years after that, until the company made some rules, and then we got dive buddies. But that dive at Devil Island was one that I'll always remember. It was a total failure, but it was an adventure.
Meet the Ocean is produced by Paul North and Andrew Gettings, with sound design by Kelsey Anderson. Special thanks to naturalist David Cothran for sharing his tale from under the ice. To see David's work, check out the Antarctic Peninsula Underwater Field Guide. Meet the Ocean is a listener-supported nonprofit. Please visit our website to find more podcasts, underwater creatures, and other educational material. Subscribe to our podcast to never miss an episode, and please rate and review on iTunes or whatever platform you choose to listen. Until next time, may the saltwater be with you.